Okay, I'd like to call the Budget Committee meeting for 12/5/24 to order. Let it be known that Don Hendricks, Mark Hetzel are here, Joan Ensign in replace of Jack Heineman. We have Ellie Newton, Steve Summer, and Tiffany Loken with us tonight. Can I have approval of the agenda?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I didn't see any public comments, so that would take us to 24/25 budget planning updates.
Just so you know, I don't know if you noticed, Mark, but Dr. Brown did Zoom in, so she's on the call as well. So we're going to start with the 24/25 budget planning, and we're going to begin with an update on the November 22 financial plan. So Joan, you weren't at the last budget committee meeting, but I think you said you listened to it.
I did.
And so we had Eric Cass from PMA here, and he presented a update on the financial plan to the budget committee. And in that update, the budget committee gave feedback on moving forward with a $14 million borrowing at next week's board meeting. So Allie and I have been working on that for the last couple of weeks. The sale for the $14 million will take place next Monday, and we will have the results of that sale at the board meeting. But one of the things that came out of that meeting was a request to spend a little bit more time talking about some of the concepts that we have on the screen. And those concepts include the interest earnings in Fund 39. And just to take a step back, Fund 39 is the fund where we pay down our debt. It's called our debt service fund. The fund equity, or what's referred to as fund balance in Fund 39. Fund 49, which is the fund that we use to pay referendum related bills. And so we want to talk about Fund 49 interest, and then Fund 49 project savings. So we want to talk about each of those four concepts as we discuss this agenda item. Rebecca, would you mind starting with the second attachment there called 2223? And if you wouldn't mind blowing that up a little bit. So Allie had the idea of putting in here as the starter to our conversation the budget and tax levy options that were presented to the board in October of 2022. And this is really important as far as telling the story for the financial plan for the referendum. And I would call your attention to the column that says referendums both approved. And then you see the row called debt repayment. So one of the things that we communicated to the public prior to the vote in November of 2022 was that the board was committed to a tax levy for that fall of $38,555,555. And that tax levy would not be increased if the referendums passed. So what you see in front of you are the several different possible scenarios that could have come out of that referendum in November of 22, ranging from if both referendums didn't pass, the board had committed to paying down debt of 6.9 million. So if you see that very bottom row, 6.9 million was going to be used to pay down debt. Only 1 million would have been used to pay down debt if the operational referendum had failed. And over to the far right, if the operational referendum had passed, but the capital question had failed, it was going to be 5.9 million. So because both referendums passed, we were working in the second column, and the commitment that we made to the community in our presentation of materials was that we would not do both a debt repayment and issue new debt if the referendum passed. If we would have done both, that would not have been manageable for the property tax levy. So the commitment was to keep the property tax levy at the 38.5 million and not do the debt repayment. However, what that meant is that funds were going to be available from the Fund 39 or debt service property tax levy to put towards the financial plan. So we knew, because we weren't paying down debt, we were going to use those funds as we issued the debt for the 175 million. So Rebecca, if you want to go back for just a moment and grab the first attachment that was with that agenda item. And if you want to blow that up a little bit. So the committee had a chance to see this last month. But what I really want to focus in on is a couple of the columns over on the right-hand side. So there's a column, Rebecca, if you can make it just a little bit bigger, please. Thank you. So there's a column called Example Levy Management Fund Equity. And what that column is doing is it's utilizing funds within Fund 39 that were levied on the property tax levy, but not used for debt service defeasance, instead are being used as we issue debt. Those funds are being used so that, and you look at the column that says annual percentage change, so that that annual percentage change for the property taxpayers is very consistent over time. So those funds are being used to help pay down debt as it's being issued, so that as a property taxpayer in the community, you would see very, very consistent debt service property tax levies over time. The next column over, the one called Example Proceeds or Interest Earnings, that column calls for the district to utilize savings in Fund 49, which is the fund that is being used to actually pay the referendum bills. Savings are coming from that fund to also help lower the property tax levy. It's an important concept to keep in mind because it's an option for the board to choose to do that or not. And there's always a trade-off with every option. So the trade-off with that option is that the funds that you see reflected in that column otherwise could be available to be used towards maintenance projects. So in Fund 49, the referendum that we asked the public to approve was open for district-wide capital maintenance projects. The board did that on purpose so that any funds available could be used in any building for maintenance-related items, including the existing middle school, if there was a decision to make some improvements there. So it's important to know the trade-off of what you see in that column is less flexibility in Fund 49. However, the board members who are on the facility committee will note and just saw a presentation from Vogel explaining the flexibility that we have in Fund 39 because of the savings that existed, both Heritage with that project being completed and the high school in Bethel project. So you haven't had a chance to see that yet. So it's in the facility committee meeting from earlier this week. But there were significant savings coming out of those projects, both from contingency and project savings that are definitely in excess of what you see in this column. But it is important to note the funds in that column help us generate the annual percentage change in the property tax levy column. The other thing to note about the property tax levy column is that percentage is below our decade-plus history of what we call net new construction. So brand new property being put onto the tax rolls for the first time is in excess of 3% over well past a decade of history in Waunakee. So what that tells you is that on the debt service end, the projected increase is less than what we actually expect to see in new property growth over time. The advantage to a plan like this is it puts the board in a very good position in the future if the board does want to have a conversation about the high school campus or something else that may come up. You would be starting your next financial plan knowing that this one ended with a percentage increase on the property tax levy lower than the expected growth in the community. So that's a good place to start a future discussion. But the alternative could be the board deciding we don't want to use any project savings towards this. We want to hold it in Fund 49 because we could use those funds at the high school. We could use those funds at the middle school. They could be applied towards a high school campus project. So it's just as important to note that there is a trade-off. That trade-off does not have to be solved for the borrowing on Monday night. So that's the good news. The borrowing on Monday night is really only 14 million. And the larger part of it, the 52 million that you see on the screen there, is not proposed until either February or March. And Allie and I want to take a really close look at that, because if we can actually push it past April 1st, our debt service payments are made on April 1st every single year. That would buy us an entire another year on our debt service schedule if we can get that past April 1st. So we're going to take a very close look at that. But the bottom line is you are not going to be making a decision next Monday night that can't be reversed on that column. There's still time. So as we begin to engage in other discussions like the high school campus, if that causes the board to pause and say, we don't want to do that, what would happen instead is the percentage increase column would be adjusted up to something like 2.75% or 3% or something else. And so just know that that column is still up for discussion. But this plan right now is based on utilizing project savings, Fund 39 tax dollars in order to come up with the bottom line that you see under that annual percentage change. Allie and I spent a lot of time working through multiple iterations of this to get to the point where it's at today. We will continue to work with the budget committee as we move into 2025 for the final portion of the 175 million. But just wanted to make sure that I could pause for a moment, answer any questions that might exist about the fund equity column or the using the Fund 39 dollars, the column that uses the Fund 49 dollars, or the column that references that percentage property tax levy change over time. So at this point, I'm just going to pause a little bit and see what questions or thoughts folks have.
In the column that has example proceeds or interest earning.
Yep.
Those are not actual numbers, those are just things you see in there, or are they actual numbers?
So that's a really good question. So Rebecca, could you slide that over so the whole box can be shown to the left? And keep going a little bit more. I'm sorry, to the left.
Oh.
Keep going a little bit further. Right there is perfect. So everything in that box references debt for the $175 million referendum. The first two columns are done. The four columns to the right are all estimates. So the $14 million borrowing is an estimate, and that will be completed on Monday. The 52 million is an estimate for what we think will happen in the spring, but it's just simply an estimate. And then the two numbers to the right, which is refinancing the 99 million, is just an estimate. And the number to the right of that is refinancing the 52 million, which again is just an estimate. So I would say that column is simply an estimate off of estimates, if that makes sense. It is the best calculation that can be made today. But as we go further along the process, like as the 14 million becomes more firm, and as we move into the spring and we're able to see what's going on with interest rates on the 52 million, what's in that column will start to firm up. But what's important for both Ally and I to know, and our financial advisors to know, if the board has a perspective, have that be zero. You know, we don't want any project savings to be used on this plan at all. We would need to get that out of there and then adjust accordingly. Or the opposite could be the case. If the majority of the board says that's too low, we just saw what came out of Heritage, we saw what came out of middle school. We think we could use more savings to lower it even further. Then we would need to know that, and then we would adjust the plan as well. I feel like this is a good middle ground right now between utilizing some of the savings that we've had to have a very manageable property tax levy. Yet also we still have flexibility in Fund 49 because we are not even coming close to using all of the savings in this plan. But with that being said, could a future board in 2 years say that they would have preferred that none of those savings would have been used on this plan because they could have used it for the middle school or high school campus? Perhaps, but that's just not predictable at this point.
So when you talk about using it for the high school, middle school, we would just reinvest it and hold it, essentially?
So an example of that could be, I'll give you an example, Mark. So the facility committee meeting in January is going to be focused on what has occurred in the last 6 months regarding the high school campus work and what's been going on there. There's a range of possibilities that we want to present to the board as far as options that could be pursued and discussed as we move into 2025. One really important question that we're going to pose next month is the board's expectation for September 1st of 2026 has to be defined. And what I mean by that is that if there is an intention on the board's end to have high school students in the existing middle school and having an educational experience in there, there are costs connected to that initial September 1st of 2026, there's costs connected to that, like a clock, bell, and PA system. So you can sit over in the high school's office and communicate to the whole campus. We would want to park funds to the side to be able to do that if the board's expectation would be to get kids over there. If, on the other hand, the board's expectations would be we're going to consider some type of referendum in November of 26. Maybe the board wants to see how the community reacts to that and wants to hold off on any investment in September before we would see the results of the referendum, then maybe you wouldn't need to hold any money towards that. So that's just kind of an example of the discussion that we want to have to really know where the board's perspective is on the issue of September 1st of 26, and then we can start planning towards that. So there's a lot of big picture conversation going on here. The good news is this plan today and what you're going to be voting on Monday does not impact it. But as we move into the spring and move further down the process, if, as an example, the majority of the board wants to go one way or another, we would want to start firming that up in this plan.
The concern I have is that we have invested a great amount of our earnings into maintenance items.
Yep.
And quite frankly, I don't know how many of those are from that initial list that we started this whole vision on. So are we beyond that? And now are these new items
Sure.
partly tied together with how we might enhance the middle school building from where it currently is without doing change orders, the effect on the high school? And so part of me felt, don't we owe the community a little bit payback from the stewardship that we've shown and maybe cut the debt reduction? On the other hand, if it would save on referendum money, we're kind of doing the same thing. And, but that's where my uncertainty lies. We haven't pared down any debt since we've started the Heritage School. It's all been reinvest, and I think we'll put to good use, but I'm a little bit concerned about it.
Yeah, and there's a lot at stake when you look at a plan like this. The one thing that I would say that as the board is thinking this through, from our chairs as far as working with the community on things like when property tax bills are going out, the board's goal of having a consistent property tax levy and that being in place for a number of years has really been well received. And we know that there are individual properties that are adjusted based on different factors. But to be able to accomplish like what's in that column off to the right, which is a very consistent, 2% to 2.25%, and knowing that that's below the historical increase in actual property growth in the community, that sets us up for future success in the conversation regarding the property tax levy. If that column had 4%, 4.5%, 5% in there, we would start drifting away from what we've been trying to accomplish over the last 5 to 7 years, and would very likely have a much more difficult time the next time we would go out to the community to ask for some type of capital project. So Allie and I have been working on this for quite a while with PMA to try to come up with what we believe is like the best blend of utilizing some project savings to say back to the community, this project has gone very well, and we want to use some of those funds to manage the levy, but yet still allow some funds to be held for that discussion on the high school, middle school campus. But that being said, this is just one option. We've looked at a lot of them. And so there's options where that column of savings is higher. There's options where it's lower. There's not a right and wrong answer to it. It's just, what do you think is the right long-term approach for the community? But it's an important discussion, which I appreciated the budget committee giving us 20 some minutes of time to really dive into this. But it's just a good reminder that as we get into 2025, we're going to want to revisit this so that we can really have the best plan in place, for the long term.
Any questions? Okay, planning for 24, 25 and beyond.
So this one will be relatively quick. What we want to talk about with this agenda item is, obviously we completed the 4th draft of the budget in October. And our goal, Allie and I's goal, is to begin the conversation about an end of the year target and goal much earlier than we did last year. And to proactively make decisions as we move through the winter and spring, instead of waiting like we did this past year towards later on in the process to make decisions. So we're wanting to prompt really earlier dialogue on this topic. And what we put in the notes is that our most recent bond rating, which we've included in here that you can take a look at, identified our fund balance level and really our debt as areas of concern. The good news is that our bond rating remained stable. It has not changed. That's a notch above where it was a few years ago. So we're in a good spot on the bond rating. It's remained in a good spot. But what you see with a bond rating is an outside independent person taking a look at it. And in the report, they did identify the fund balance level as an area of concern. We are mentioning that administration would prefer to have some type of goal to end the fund 10-year at least zero. So that would not have a negative balance, or slightly positive in order to be in the, let's say, the 0 to 250,000 range. And then in order to get there, we would need to have the ability to allocate expenditures across various accounting funds. One example would be to allocate post-employment benefits, so the retirement benefits, to Fund 73, or a post-employment benefit trust fund, utilizing deposits from prior years. Now we're going to circle back to that topic a little bit later in the meeting. Another example would be to allocate referendum eligible expenses from Fund 10 to Fund 49. The items that caused the fund balance decline in 23-24 still are in effect today in 24-25, and they're topics we need to address. That includes things like termination benefits, health insurance changes that take place during the school year, health insurance rate increases that kick in on July 1st, our district business insurance renewal rates, etc. So what we're just wanting to bring up at this point, we're not asking for any action, but we're wanting to find out if there's a willingness on the budget committee's end for Allie and I to really start that dialogue earlier than what we've done in the past, and start putting ideas in front of you instead of waiting to the spring or maybe early summer. So we're just a check-in to see the thoughts on whether or not you are willing to have us start down that road a little bit earlier this year. So thoughts?
Yeah, I think earlier is better. It gives us time to see if there's things that we can make actionable or address in the meantime, but totally open to earlier conversation.
Well, I think the setting of a goal is important to guiding our decision making. I mean, as you've said, by June X, our budget is what our budget is. And so if we know what the goals are, that certainly needs to be a lens we look at for the unbudgeted requests that we typically get throughout the school year.
Yep. So I'm hearing an openness to putting this on the agenda in January, and Allie and I can start working a little bit more on this and bringing some ideas forward. Okay. So the next item under 24-25 is special education budget items. And Tiffany's going to come up and join us. Thank you for being here, Tiffany. Before Tiffany comes up, there was a request at while she's coming up, there was a request at the last budget committee meeting to provide a little bit more background and information really on special ed funding. And so we've done that, and I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that before we jump into the topics that are in the notes. A couple of things that Allie and I wanted to share some information with the committee on. We talked last spring about the topic of high-cost special education aid and the aggressive approach that we took to go out and seek those funds. I don't think we've come back since then to share with what the results were. So the results of the high-cost special ed claim for 23-24 was our district ended up receiving the third largest payment from the state out of the 231 districts who participated. So it's important to note that it's optional to participate in this program. So you don't see 400 and plus districts doing it. Nobody's required to do it. So 231 districts participated. To share for perspective, our claim was larger than much larger districts like Appleton, Green Bay, and Eau Claire The main reason for that is with the training that we went through last spring, Allie and Tiffany and I learned about the various methods that exist within the state system to maximize those claims. And to say that Tiffany took a deep dive in that is an understatement. And so she really pursued this. I certainly didn't expect we were going to be the third highest out of 231 districts, but I knew that we were going to be very proactive with that approach. So that's a huge kudos to the effort of Tiffany to go through and do that deep dive. And Allie handled all the actual entering of the data into the DPI system. So the two of them did an amazing job with that. Another one that we participate in that again is optional. The state has a social worker claim program that you do not have to participate in, but you are allowed to enter in requests for your social workers. And the state's been adding money into this program in the last couple state budgets. We had the 14th highest claim out of the 123 districts that submitted claims. And then the other program that we've talked a lot about is the transfer service program. So our total claim for 24-25 was $223,000. We don't yet have the complete log of what every district across the state put in for. So we can't really put perspective on that one yet, but that's the total that we submitted this year. And then Rebecca, would you mind grabbing the file that's called special education data? One of the things that I've mentioned in a couple of the budget committee meetings is administratively, we want to do a better job of giving the board data so that you have information in front of you when you're making decisions and when you're having discussions with community members about different topics. And one of the areas that I know that I want to do a better job of getting you data on is special education. Obviously, you do see Tiffany when she comes in with requests, which is different than a lot of other administrators in the district. But it's important to be able to give information and some perspective on Waunakee compared to Dane County districts and where we really are with this topic. So what this first graph is doing, and Rebecca, would you slide down just a little bit more? That's perfect. What you see on the first graph, the dot means for each district, the dot is their percentage of students that have been identified with IEPs. Rebecca, would you mind? I'm sorry, just a little bit the other way so I can see the district names. Perfect. So on the far right, you can see starting with the far right. Oh, sorry. That a little bit for us. You would see on the far right, Waunakee, you see Verona, and then you can kind of go to the left. The dots are important because you can see Verona. So the second district on the far right, the dot is the lowest percentage in Dane County. So Verona, thank you, Rebecca. Verona has the lowest percentage of their student population identified with IEPs. The next lowest percentage is Waunakee and Monona Grove. So Waunakee and Monona Grove have the second lowest number of students identified with IEPs. And then you can kind of go from there and see where other districts are at. The blue graph shows you the total number of students that have IEPs in the district. So if you look at Waunakee on the far right, that number is a little bit over 400. But if you want to contrast it to another district that is in very similar size to us, on the far left is DeForest, and DeForest is over 500. So very similar district to Waunakee, but a very different number of students with IEPs. One thing that's important about a slide like this is to really give you the data to have that perspective about whether or not we have a high number of students with IEPs in Waunakee. Do we have an average number? Do we have a low number? Because without giving you data like this, you just don't have that perspective. Tiffany did look up today. What did you find about the state average?
The state average is about 14.5%. is the state average for, the state of percent of students in special education.
So it's important to note that by perspective, we're below the state average and we're definitely below the county average. So that's one takeaway from this slide. Rebecca, if you want to go to the next one, please. Couple other things we wanted to share with you. No, I'm sorry, that same document, but just scroll to the next page. Yep, perfect. And then just scroll down to the next. There we go. So what the next piece of data shows is the IEPs and how they've changed. So this is Waunakee only data. And this shows that the number of students that we have with IEPs has been increasing since 2020. So we've talked about that at these meetings. When Tiffany came to the last meeting to talk about a staffing need, she had mentioned we're up about 17% since 2020. But I do think it's important to note that, yes, we do have increased needs in Waunakee since 2020. But by perspective, they're still low compared to Dane County and low compared to the state, but we are seeing increasing needs in this area. So Rebecca, if you want to scroll down. What this slide shows us, which is really important, is our professional staff in special education and the ratio that we're maintaining for our professional staff to the number of students with IEPs. And you can see since 2020, we've been very consistent. So we've been in the 11 range. So basically the student to professional staff ratios in the 11s. So we haven't added an abnormally high number of staff into special ed. What we've really added since 2020 has kept pace with the number of IEPs we've been identifying in our district. So that's just an important item to note.
So Steve, this is just special ed staff to special ed students, correct?
Yes, yep,
Okay.
exactly. Yep.
Specifically teachers, so not parents or anything.
Or not Paris?
No,
No,
it's just teachers.
Yep, just teachers. Now you will see when Allie and I get into the full budget process next month, our broader professional certified staff looks very different than this. There's been a wide disconnect between our student enrollment increase and the number of staff we've hired. You're going to see that next month, but special ed is not the reason why. So special ed is very, very consistent and is staying consistent with the number of students with IEPs. We just wanted you to see that data again, to have the perspective on special ed. Back, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And here's some financial data, and this is, again, very, very interesting. So this is the most recent audited financial data that's available through the state. And what this data is telling you on the screen is, so these are expenditures, and these are expenditures where the calculation or what this data entails is the special education investment being made in each of these districts divided by their total population. So it's important to note that this data or this metric that's being provided is not being divided by the number of special ed students. It's being divided by the total population of the district to come up with an investment in special ed on a per student basis for the entire district. So it gives you the same perspective for all the Dane County districts. And with that data, you would see that on a per student basis, Waunakee is the third lowest investment in special ed. Now, for those of you that have seen charts like this before, this will make sense to you because in total, our expenditure per student is in like the third or fourth lowest for the county. So the point that this slide makes is that special ed is very consistent with the district's overall spend per student, which ranges from third to fourth lowest in the district. So there isn't anything different happening with special ed compared to our overall expenditures. It's falling right in where you would expect us to see for a district that typically spends the third or fourth lowest in the county. We're sharing this with you just to be able to, again, do a better job of presenting information and data. Next month, you're going to see in the first look at the 25-26 budget process that Allie and I are going to be bringing in significant amounts of data on our students, on our staff, on our expenditures, so that we can start putting ourselves in a better position to use this data for making decisions. It's similar to what I used to do pre-COVID, when the budgeting process was much more thorough and quite a bit of a longer document. But our intentions are to go back to that. And what you can see on some of these special ed slides is just really the type of information we're able to bring in. So I know this is maybe a little bit of a deeper dive than what he was looking for, but there was a request to get more information on special ed, and that's what we wanted to do. I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany, who wants to talk about a couple of financial issues that exist in special ed. I'm going to note that we're not going to talk about, excuse me, anything regarding the students, what schools they're in or what grades they're in, because we want to make sure that we're not identifying or even coming close to identifying where the student need would be. So we're just going to use the term student-specific need as we talk about these, just so you're aware of that. Tiffany?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a student that requires full-time nursing services. And so as part of his IEP, that's being written into the IEP. And I think it's important to note, I know Steve has laid out, it's going to come kind of out of our contingency budget for this year. But I think it's really important to note that those nurses will also be billing Medicaid, which is money that comes back to the district. And also when we get to high cost aid claims, we'll get money back from high cost. So probably not 100% covered, but we will a large portion, even though it's coming out of contingency, is going to come back to the district. So I think that's important to note. So that's the first one. Anything else you wanted to say about the nursing contract?
No, we are recommending utilizing contingency. So we do have $100,000 contingency. We don't have another source right now to go to fund this contract outside of starting to make reallocation or budget reductions, which always is an option. But since we haven't used the contingency, that's our first recommendation, would be to use the contingency fund to pay for this contract.
So what percent of the contingency fund spent could we expect back before the end of this budget year?
So it's possible that this contract could utilize about 75% of the contingency if the contract is in full for the entire year.
And then are you asking what we would get back though?
Yes.
Okay, what we would get back from Medicaid and through high cost, that'd be a little bit hard to estimate. I don't know.
Yeah, so like with high cost, you get 90% of it.
Okay.
That's claimable, but then it depends on how many claims are submitted, how much you actually get back. So we really wouldn't know the total amount until we know how much has been put into high cost, how many districts are claiming high cost, and then what portion of that we actually get.
Okay, and then once we file for high cost, if the need exists next year to continue the service, are we guaranteed the funding will be there into the future, or is this a resource that we're going to have to pick up the difference if more schools apply for high cost, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it's a little bit, I'd say we'd use the same strategy next year, most likely. Although just because if we take it out of local funds instead of federal funds, we do better with high cost in terms of that claim. Because even with high cost, we'll have to subtract out any Medicaid reimbursement fee yet. So we'll have to subtract that out for high cost. So, and we could also budget for it out of federal dollars, but then we can't get as much back at high cost. So it's just kind of a balancing act. But yes, we could budget for it if we knew, like, we didn't know at the beginning of this year, this was gonna be a need. Otherwise, I would have tried to find a budget line for it before the year started, so it was something that came up later in the year. So if I know that this is a need for next year, Steve and I would work together on what we think the best spot to pull the money from based on how much reimbursement we can get from different programs.
But the claim dollars are not guaranteed, right?
It's this
It's
kind of
that year to
shifting
year shift.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a high cost. It's just what percentage are we gonna get back based on how many other districts? You know, it'd be hard to predict.
So. As you know, I've supported just about every initiative you brought forth. But as I start looking at our financial realities, I mean, I didn't go back and do analysis of how much we added to our budget for special ed or any other subject area throughout the school year last year that wasn't in the budget. And I think it's a concern of mine that if we're truly trying to get our budget under control, those are numbers that at least we have to think about without just a blanket approval. Is there, we really don't have an option. We have this kid and we have to provide the service, correct?
That's correct.
And either we do it totally out of
And there's a
pocket
chance
or.
that the service may not be needed. I mean, even, 3 months from now, it depends on,
Right.
on the health of the student.
I mean, we do appreciate you bringing that up, Mark, because obviously the previous agenda item that we just talked about, we talked about trying to set an end of the year goal. That adds even more importance to beginning the conversations earlier in the year than later in the year, so that we can identify where do we want to get to. As an organization, one of the real challenges that we have that isn't related to the nursing contract, but just in general, is because we have turned over all of the building and department savings back to the building and departments. There's nowhere for Allie and I to go to try to reallocate funds when things like this occur. We probably need to change that past practice to allow us to start adjusting that as student needs evolve and as changes occur during a school year, we have an ability to adjust as we move through the year so we can hit targets at the end of the year that we want to. So we share exactly the concern that you brought up, because we don't want to get to next summer and be another $500,000 in the hole at the end of the year. And at some point, let's say, have our bond rating decline. But what we're going to need to be able to do is be in a position where we can react. And whether it's a legal bill or a utility bill or a legal settlement or a contract that comes up for a student need, we have to be more flexible and be able to adjust instead of waiting to the end of the year and not being able to do anything about it, which probably does mean some of our past practices are going to have to change, which is why Allie and I really want to get that conversation started. There are a number of things that we want to throw on the table for discussion. A lot of them are a change in past practice, but they're things that other districts have already had to do years ago to make ends meet that we may want to start considering. And I think we need to start doing that, whether it's this or whether it's something else that comes up. So we appreciate the dialogue. We agree that we need to have a goal. We need to try to get to a certain spot by the end of the year. And I think that's exactly the reason why we want that dialogue to happen.
And not unappreciative.
Oh, yeah.
Tiffany specifically and the three of you together, what you've done with the high expense return, it's really been a benefit for the district. It's just how we got to weigh things. And so I appreciate those comments. So are you asking for a motion?
She could probably go through the.
Okay.
Go through all three.
Go through all, okay.
Sounds good. And then we have a situation at the middle school in particular where we are hoping to, we have two paraprofessional positions that have kind of gone unfilled that we haven't been able to fill. And so based on the needs in that building, we would like to, if possible, not fill those two paraprofessional positions and instead fill a teacher position. Those paraprofessional positions are through transfer service. So the estimate for a paraprofessional is somewhere around 30,000. So we'd like to combine those and have a teacher fill that out for the rest of this year and then going into next year as well. So that was just a proposal, like the funding is there for the paraprofessionals through transfer service, but we wanted to come in and see if it would be possible to essentially take those funds and combine them into a teacher position instead of a two.
So how would that work? Because right now you've got two, I'm assuming who are helping two different teachers.
They're unfilled positions. We don't
Okay, but I mean, if they
fill them.
were here,
Oh, right.
right? And so you would have a new full-time teacher and she would divide the load work basically of however many you have in the middle school.
Right, yeah. We have this year in middle school and intermediate school are the heaviest loads for special education this year. Number of high need students at both buildings is pretty significant this year. So.
Do you suspect it'll be easier to recruit and retain a full-time teacher rather than the two paras?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's generally easier to retain a teacher. Sometimes it's difficult to hire a teacher, but in this situation, we know we have people internally that are working towards certification. So we know we might have some people, and again, that would probably only be for the rest of this year, but we at least have some leads on some possibilities. No idea if they would apply or if we would, how that would turn out in terms of the process, but we at least know we have some internal people working on that certification that might be interested in a teacher position. So.
And the one thing I would share about this one is Allie went through the process to request the funding. It was in the number we had given you before, the transfer service claim, and we've not spent the money. So even though depending on the cost of the teacher that would be hired, by the time they'd actually be hired, there's no chance the cost of that person for the remainder of the year would exceed the 60,000 that we've already claimed.
It was 70.
Oh, 70.
35.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no chance it would cost more than that, so.
Any questions?
And then we have, the last one is just, we have been notified and we have an enrollment for a student that is coming to one of our buildings that requires a full-time paraprofessional. And at the building, we currently are maxed out in terms of all of those paraprofessionals are assigned to individual students. So we sat down and tried to figure out a way of shifting staff, and there's just no way with a student coming in that we're going to be able to cover that particular student. So this would again be like a transfer of service request. Now, because the student is coming in in January, we'll have to submit in September of next year, because obviously we didn't know the student was coming in and we had the deadline to submit this year. So we can still submit next year. And Steve's better explaining the timing of when the money comes in, but yes, we'll still be able to get transfer of service. It's just a mid-year start, so.
But it means basically a half a year of unbudgeted salary.
For a paraprofessional, yes.
That could go to high cost though,
Okay.
because most students with one-to-one paras qualify for high cost.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And Mark did send us an email before the meeting to ask a little bit of a deeper question on transfer service. So what we shared with Mark was the financial impact can be a little bit different depending on the timing. So when we talked about under number 2, the 2 paras, Allie was able to work with Tiffany to put in that request up front for the 24-25 school year, because we knew about the kids, they had moved in. This one is a little bit different because of it happening in January. Allie can't put in the request until next fall, which affects 25-26. In the end, the effect is the same. It's just that for this one, it comes further down the road than it does for the positions where we know the students up front. So the timing can vary a little bit, and the way that the funding flows is a little bit different. The ultimate conclusion of transfer service is between the transfer service and state categorical aid. You do receive all of the funding back between the two sources. It's just the timing between the years looks a little different.
If there are any questions, we need a motion.
Motion to approve all of the proposal to hire and change positions as identified here.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Thank you.
Okay, so at the HR committee meeting earlier this week, there was a discussion regarding wellness clinic. That discussion led to the HR committee making a recommendation to next Monday night's board meeting to expand the hours on Wednesdays. So there was data included in the budget committee packet that we pulled over from the HR committee packet. Both of you had a chance to look at it earlier this week. So I've asked Mark if you had any questions at all about this topic. Otherwise, we'll just move on if you don't have any questions. All right. Thank you. So Allie's gonna take the 25-26 discussion. Allie?
Okay, so this is the time of the year we start enrollment planning for the next school year. So we did attach the updated enrollment report in there. We are recommending utilizing the 5-year average. We did use that last year and it got us within one of what we estimated. So for 25-26, the model is estimating an increase of 16 students at 4427. We just continue to see larger graduating classes be filled by smaller kindergarten classes. And then to fill that gap, we just continue to see community growth. We are often protected by losing enrollment by students coming in through open enrollment. So we will be bringing in January the open enrollment spots that you guys approve. But other than that, do we need approval for moving forward with the 5 years?
Unless there's any questions or concerns.
Don't think so.
Plus or minus one is pretty good.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to high level budget planning. We've started to put together the first budget model for 25-26. So we just wanted to bring you up to date on some of the assumptions we're using for those estimates. For revenues, we're using the $325 per student. We have 32% for special education categorical aid, although we're hopeful that we'll get more than that. The state, there's been a lot of talk about putting more revenues into special education funding. So we're hopeful that'll go above 32%, but we're estimating 32% to be conservative. We have the student enrollment using the 5-year projection, which was the increase of 16 students. And then we also have our interest earnings declining by 100,000 each year to match what the Fed is doing with lowering rates. We did keep Act 12 in there, which was a new revenue this year. That was related to personal property taxes, and we kept that in there for 25-26 and then also 26-27. We do have the November 2024 operational referendum that passed in there. And then some expenditure assumptions that we're using for CPI and the compensation systems, we have 4.6% in there. Classified staff referendum pay increases, so that portion of the referendum for bringing their pay up to average. And then we also have a 5% health insurance increase, a 5% increase for utilities and transportation. We added in the middle school utilities for 26-27 for the new building. We kind of modeled that off of what the intermediate looks like, so we could get a pretty close estimate to what that would cost for us. And then we also added $70,000 to the district property insurance to match the increases that we saw this year. These are the issues that need to be addressed when it comes to expenditures. These are the same topics we brought to you for 23-24, continue to be an issue in 24-25, and then also 25-26. So those include termination benefits, post-employment benefits, health insurance changes and increases from June to July, and then maintenance costs. And then also we've talked about our contingency budget going up, and then also keeping fund balance at a healthy level. So as I mentioned, there's been significant discussion regarding special education categorical aid. We're hopeful that it will go up. There's been talk from anywhere from 40 to 90%. So hopefully we'll see an increase above the 32%. Any decreases in Fund 10 should be allocated accordingly to the expenditure categories that need to be addressed above. So if we have any savings anywhere, we would hope to allocate it to those categories that need to be addressed. And then we also, in the event that special education categorical aid does not increase through the state budget, we would have to look at budget reallocations to address those issues.
So Ellie, when we're talking about reallocation from Fund 10.
Yeah.
Would those end up being sub funds in Fund 10, so it goes towards fund balance, or do some of them end up going to Fund 73 and some of the other funds that we have? How does that work?
Sure. So anything that we're not making up in Fund 27 with the increase in categorical aid would have to come from Fund 10. So yes, it would go to Fund 73 to cover the OPEB contribution, or it would have to go to Fund 50 if there wasn't any, or if there wasn't a positive balance there. Is that what you're asking?
Right. So with Fund 27, if we went up 8%,
Yep.
that would go into our fund balance, and then we figure out how does this disperse that?
Essentially, yes, because the transfer to Fund 27 would be lower. Correct.
Okay.
So then I'll ask Rebecca to bring up the snapshot that we've taken from our budget model. We use 24-25 as a base year, and then 25-26 and 26-27 are shown. So you can see the revenues and the expenses, and then on the bottom, we show the net loss for each year. The items in yellow are the issues that we've talked about that need to be addressed. Those are all at 0, and we show the net loss without addressing those issues as is. So in January, we hope to bring a deeper dive of those topics and kind of a plan of how we can address those issues. Because as you can see, even without budgeting for those, we're already in the negative.
I think I'll first of all just start with some of the positives. So the fact that the community supported the referendum is a huge positive in this budget planning process. It's just a small note on here, but it's really a big deal to be able to say that the classified staff over the 2 years that we have on the screen, their pay is going to be brought to the average of the county. So that's a huge accomplishment. The other very significant accomplishment is that all of the other staff will remain with competitive pay compared for Dane County. So we have a CPI increase and compensation system increase. Those are the positives that you see here. We've addressed some of the challenges that we've had, like the property insurance, investment in utilities, transportation, health insurance. The areas in yellow still need to be addressed. We are hopeful that the discussion that is very likely to take place at the state level over special education aid will provide the board with more funding in special ed, which frees up funds, to your question, Mark, in Fund 10, where then the board would have the ability to talk about things like post-employment benefits and funding it from within the budget as opposed to Fund 73. So we feel like the base budget has a lot of positives behind it. It has a few challenges we still need to address, But I would say the fundamental thing that this is bringing to the forefront is our administrative team is going to have to shift thinking from new initiatives or new investments coming out of new dollars towards the idea of reallocation within our existing funds. It is something that other districts have had to do for a number of years now. It is not something we've had to do much of in Waunakee. But as our student enrollment becomes very stable to only small growth, and we are utilizing our funds to make sure we are being competitive with pay for staff, additional investments are going to have to be made by decisions to reallocate from within. Dr. Brown and I have already been talking about this. We've been throwing around some ideas. We are going to need to engage our broader administrative team and ultimately our staff in this conversation, because there are a number of strategies that exist out there, but we need to implement those strategies in a thoughtful way. But this is really highlighting the fact that fundamentally, as we move forward over the next couple of years, as new priorities emerge, we're going to have to become better as a team with bringing forward reallocation strategies for dollars that are being spent on items that maybe we don't value as much today compared to some of the new initiatives coming forward. So that's something you're going to hear us talking about a lot, because we're not going to be able to create a list of, let's say, $250,000 worth of new investments when we just don't have it. We're going to have to, we can create a list of priorities, but then we're also going to have to work together as a team to create a list of what do we think we would want to reallocate as we move forward. And that's just something as an administrative team, we are going to have to embrace and really look to figure out our process for really reallocation as we move forward. So it's just going to be a change process for us.
And Steve, if I may add to that, good evening, everyone. Just wanted the committee to know and understand an initial conversation began with the principals and assistant principals as recent as this week at our cabinet meeting. And some of this information some of the decision making with the building administrators will come through this notion of the continuous improvement process as we're being led by CISA 2, looking at instruction and understanding what are those things that what's effective, right? And those things that are effective, we will continue. Those things that are not, because we do not have data to support or evidence to support that they are, having conversations around essentially pivoting and moving in a different direction, or in some instances, maybe eliminating what we know has not proven to be effective. So just wanted the committee to know that I started the conversation with the principals this week.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any feedback from the budget committee members at all on this topic? Like Allie mentioned, we're going to be diving much deeper into this next month.
It's not an easy exercise, but yeah, it'll be a necessary one. And always the best place to start is if there's ways to reduce costs on things that aren't considered value added to students directly, like what we've talked about already with utilities and decreasing those costs, because I mean, they would notice it if there's not electricity and so that's happened, but it's not as directly tied to the programs and staffing and things like that and how that's allocated, and that's a tougher one, but yeah. And I know there's at least one subcommittee member who asks about it on a semi-regular basis, so I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear that that's getting attention.
So we look forward to bringing this back next month.
Okay. So the 23-24 final audit report, we have attached in there one of the preliminary drafts. Although today we did get the final draft and that will be presented on Monday at the regular board meeting. We also attached our most recent OPEB actuarial study. One really positive thing to note from that is our liability decreased about $2.5 million. So that's really good news, meaning that the level at which we have to fund it goes down when that liability goes down. So if there's any questions on the draft audit, we'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, the final draft or the final audit report will be presented at the board meeting on Monday.
Ellie, if I could just mention one thing for the board members that we'll just want to make sure all board members are aware of. When we mentioned in here the OPEB reduction, one of the main reasons for that was the handbook change for teacher compensation. And so what I mean by that is for years, teachers were earning points that weren't fully awarded on an annual basis when pay increases were being calculated. Those points were being set aside in a bank for payment at retirement, and that kept growing and growing and growing. During and around the COVID timeframe, Brian Gravarsky led a group of teachers through a process to reimagine the teacher compensation system, to move away from a process where points were being earned but weren't being paid during someone's career. A pretty significant change was presented to the board for teacher compensation, a teacher compensation system after quite a bit of effort that went into that process. The banked points has significantly been reduced because the board has been fully funding the compensation system on an annual basis since the change was made. This is one of the main reasons why you're seeing this change. So it's a very, very positive change that instead of deferring that until retirement or later on, the board is now funding it on an annual basis when compensation increases are being approved. And what you see on the screen is a direct result of that change. There's other changes. Our demographics are changing. Our assets in Fund 73 have increased. So it's a variety of things combined together, but I don't want to understate how important that change was to the teacher compensation system to fund it on an annual basis instead of deferring it until when someone retires.
Should that go down in the next couple of years as we have our senior staff retiring who are on the old retirement compensation plan?
Absolutely. Yep. And as we continue to fully, assuming the board would continue to fully fund compensation increases instead of deferring it like was done in the past,
Sure.
The combination of those things will continue to happen as we move forward.
And what's the year of demarcation when we no longer have? What was the cutoff for senior
Sure.
staff to receive the old system?
I believe it was 2008
Okay.
is when I believe we made the change off the top of my head.
Thank you.
So Data Wrangler, I want to ask Rebecca to open up the attachment for just a minute. If you could blow it up a little bit. I know it's in small print. So as a reminder, Allie and I began the conversation with the budget committee probably earlier in the summer about a product called Data Wrangler, which had the ability to provide information to the district regarding our meters, our electrical meters in each of the buildings, and a software system that was aligned with it it coincided with John Kramer bringing to the facility committee a request to upgrade the meters in each of our buildings so that we would receive notifications when the power goes out, which is now done, and we are getting those notifications, and that has all been set up, which is wonderful. But in addition to that, we were, based on the board feedback, we went back to this system called Data Wrangler, and they committed to a 3-month trial. So the 3-month trial started on October 1st. We have been receiving reports from them since October 1st, and we have been making changes since then. I wanted to give you just a brief snapshot of some of the conversations that have occurred. One of them, so Data Wrangler discovered this in their review of the data compared to our school calendar. So they discovered that during days that were a non-school day, but yet was like a Monday, so it was like a normal, fully operational day, we didn't go to our weekend settings. So they threw out the idea of looking at going to our weekend settings. And again, typically when there's no teachers in the building. So an example when we were able to do this was Thanksgiving break. So when there's nobody in the building and it's a Monday through Friday, to implement our off hours schedule. And so we've done that. So you can see what the savings were estimated. So an example, in Thanksgiving break, it was $1,236 to go into the system and change it so that we weren't functioning as if it was a normal Thursday or a normal Friday. Christmas break is expected to save $3,300 in utilities. The biggest one that they discovered was number 2, which has to do with the on-demand charges that get carried on our bill throughout the year based on usage. What they discovered is that we weren't syncing, which would make sense because North American Mechanical's goal is to have our equipment functioning properly and on. Their goal isn't to look at like the cycle of a utility bill and turn things on or off based on the cycle of a utility bill. But what Data Wrangler brought to our attention was that if we could turn off the chillers prior to the new utility bill cycle on November 1st, it reduced the demand, which then reduced the demand charges for months to come. So as you can see under 2A, by turning them off, the on-peak demand savings per month was calculated at $5,440. And we did do that. So we did implement that change. And so then they're going to continue to track that as we go each month. But something as small as, let's say, not allowing air conditioning systems to kick on like November 8th or November 7th, which can occur because when you have your set settings, if the temperature and everything hits a certain point, it will kick on. And they saw that in our data and said, you should manually turn them off so that they just can't even kick on. So that was number 2. One thing they saw at the new school, again, with being able to actually look at the meters for the new school, they saw that the entire HVAC system was firing up like at 6 a.m. And because everything was turning on at the same time, the demand, they could see it on the meter, just went way up all at once. And basically we pay charges every month based on that demand that's occurring. So they worked with North American Mechanical and said, let's not do that. Let's start earlier. So let's start earlier. Let's say 5 a.m. and let's fire up the north end of the building. Then wait 30 minutes and fire up the middle of the building. Then wait 30 more minutes and fire up the other end of the building. So this savings wasn't as significant. That was about 150 a month, but it was for one school. At the high school, they noticed their their software was able to detect that HVAC system was running 24/7. So they are able to see that in one section of the high school, basically the programming was not functioning properly on just one unit, and it was running all day, even in the middle of the night. So North American Mechanical was then able to go in and make the maintenance adjustments, but without seeing the software and seeing that that was occurring, the temperature settings in the building were fine. It's just there was one piece of equipment in the high school that was malfunctioning. We wanted to share this with you. This was our first meeting with them in October as what we've been doing with them. There was a second meeting in November, and we will have to decide by February whether or not we want to continue with them. So I know it was important to this committee that the district use the data that we get from Data Wrangler, that we actually make changes, and that we continue to seek changes. I know, Dawn, you mentioned in our earlier discussion, this is a cost area that is worthy of our review to try to see what can we get out of here that could go somewhere else. And you would want it to be in excess of the cost of the product, right? So we don't want to just add the cost of the product and then not be able to generate savings to offset it. So we want to continue down that road. We've got a new set of ideas we're working on right now. Ultimately, in the end, we just wanted you to be aware of the fact the trial has started. We're meeting with them regularly. We're implementing change, and the next round is the first set of bills after the first changes, so then we can monitor the results. So at some point, either January or February, we're going to bring this back for further discussion. Okay.
Thank you.
So fund balance policy, one of the things that we wanted to talk about is the recognition of what the policy says, really compared to what our practice in recent years has been. And I want to just kind of reference that sentence at the bottom of the notes. As an example, the increase in Fund 10 expenditures from 23-24 to 24-25 is 4.1 million. A fund balance goal of 15% would require a 24-25 end of the year balance of a positive $621,000. That's just to maintain that percent. That's not even to get the fact that we're below that percent right now. That would be to stay at 15. A 10% goal would require a $414,000 positive balance. We all know our budget doesn't have the flexibility to end up with a positive $621,000 at the end of the 24-25 year. We were talking earlier in the meeting of trying to set a goal of getting it to zero and some of the changes we would need to make. I think it's important to note that a long-term change would be necessary to turn the tide on this, to change it in a different direction. And an example of that could be a 5-year strategy of changing the contingency from 100,000 to a $500,000 or a 600,000, which would be accomplished by an additional 100,000 per year for the next 5 years, until we get to the point where we've got a contingency high enough that we know it could lead to numbers like that. Other examples of what could be looked at, and Jack talked about this at the facility committee. He talked about the rebate we're getting back from the Inflation Reduction Act. That could be potentially deposited into Fund 10. That could be a booster of our fund balance. And there's other ideas that we could look at, but we wanted to make sure that we had the conversation, or starting to have the conversation, that we don't currently have a mechanism to reach that goal of 15% or maintain that goal of 15%. If that's important to the board, we're going to have to start putting some practice changes in place to get there. And there's a couple of different approaches. A different idea, if the board no longer has the goal of 15%, would be to revise the policy and say something like a range of 10% to 15%, and then plan accordingly to try to make sure you're in that range. That's a different approach to take. If the committee had an interest in the policy committee taking a different look at the policy that could be done, or if the committee prefers the policy the way it's written and instead wants us to work on a practice change, a budgeting practice change, we could work on that as well. There's no answer needed on this tonight other than to say that we've got to keep this at the front of our minds, because once again, we had the reminder from the Standard & Poor's folks who did the bond rating review. Fund balance is not currently an area of strength for us. It's an area that needs attention, and there's different ways of doing it. My personal opinion is that this is something that would be best addressed over multiple fiscal years instead of just one. And one way to do it would be to look at the contingency budget of the district and increase it over time to the point where it could put us in the situation of having end of the year balances of that size. Just one idea. So we want to continue that discussion as well as we move forward. The last agenda item, and then everyone can go home if you want to watch the Packer game or not, if you have Amazon Prime, is the transportation policy and the connection to the new middle school. And this is something that crossed my mind as I had a conversation with Dawn about high school students and our transportation policy, and then some of the changes we made at Heritage with the policy. And then also we made the change to allow parents to put in a hardship request. And so it kind of all came together with wanting to just connect a little bit about the topic of the transportation policy. So what I started with in this agenda item was just a reminder that we've attached the board-approved hazardous transportation plan that begins in the 26-27 school year for the middle school. And that happens to be on page 19 of the attachment. The next steps in our evaluation of the transportation policy was something that we brought up during the 23-24 school year, which was the idea of first focusing in on the transportation hazardous plan, and then secondly, coming back and potentially discussing some of the significantly more complicated parts of our system, like the shuttle buses, alternative transportation, private school transportation, the way we manage that, our policy for middle school students and high school students and how we manage that. So Dawn had a request for us to take a look at the high school part of it. Before we did that, I wanted to find out what your thoughts were on next steps really in our evaluation. We're more than happy to jump back into this because it's been a little bit since we've talked about it. I just want to make sure we're pointed in the right direction with what we're doing as far as that review. Because as an example, if the board doesn't want to go down the path of looking at the shuttle buses and the alternative transportation, then it wouldn't be a good investment of administrators' time to then bring that data back. That's a huge topic. I know that a year ago, when administration presented on transportation policy, we were focusing on the hazardous transportation plan because the thoughts were that changes to alternative transportation, the policy limit and shuttle buses, the shuttles between the buildings, the way we handle private schools would be something that would need plenty of advance notice to the community before a change like that was made. We never really dove into the topic of whether or not the board even really wanted that reviewed. Because if there isn't an interest in reviewing that, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to go down that path. Our current practice on shuttle buses and alternative transportation has been in place for over 20 years. So it is not a minor change to discuss that. That doesn't mean it's not worthy of being discussed, but it's just really important to acknowledge the scope of it. Because as I mentioned before, what our system currently allows a parent to do is you can have your first grader at Prairie, you can live at the northern part of our district, and you can request for your student to go to Mary Lake in Westport in the southern part of our district for daycare. That means that student leaves school early, gets on the shuttle bus, that bus then drives to Arboretum. So again, that bus has to get to Arboretum before the Arboretum day ends, which is why they leave Prairie early. They get to Arboretum, then they have to get on the right Arboretum bus to go to where they're supposed to go. Because remember, there's no Prairie bus that's going to go into Westport over to Mary Lake. So it's a very complicated system. It's been set up like that for a number of years. If there is an interest, it's definitely a dialogue we need to begin. We're going to need to engage daycare centers. We're going to need to engage parents. We're going to need to discuss with the principals, but that's the way they affect their end of their day. So we wanted to talk about that. Again, we don't need an answer tonight, but that's really part of the scope of this. Dawn brought up the topic of high school students. It's very complicated right now for high school students. Our policy is difficult to follow. It happens every year where there are a number of families who were eligible for busing in 7th and 8th grade in the exact same house that they're in, then becomes ineligible in 9th grade. And for a lot of parents, that doesn't make sense to them. So we do get that feedback every single year from people. And I think that's the point you were bringing up, is that this, to a parent, it doesn't make sense. You know, because your kids still can't drive. There's not a big difference between 8th grade and 9th grade. And it seems very arbitrary. So we have that issue as well. And now we have the new issue that in the 26-27 school year, the hazardous transportation.
So that part of it is that that's also really far to me.
Sure. Yep. Oh,
So
right.
anything
Yes.
over a mile
Right.
seems like a burden.
Right. Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, that's the other thing we talked about. Thank you. There's a difference in the mile that we currently have for K6 for 712. It goes to 1.75 miles. So thank you. So there's the issue with the mileage being different. And in addition to that, there's the changes that are taking place between 7th and 8th grade and 9th grade. So what we're trying to begin the dialogue with you tonight is, what is the scope of changes that you would like us to begin evaluating? Is there something that you want us to start with first compared to something else? And we just wanted to open it up to a dialogue to kind of get some perspective on what are the types of things you would like us to work on in this area. Not to make it more complicated, Dr. Brown has brought up some ideas on some things that she has seen in other districts that would be improvements to our system that I think would be received very positively Examples of that would be better technology. So in her previous district, there was an app that parents could follow and see how the buses were functioning. So that's a possibility. Student badges can be used to badge on and off buses to be able to instantly tell a kid if it's the wrong bus or not. That can be connected to the app. So as an example, if a first grader goes up and scans their badge, tells them if it's the right bus, they then get on. You can set it up so the parents get a notification that their student just got on the bus. They can then look at the app and follow it to see when it's getting to where it's going to be at. So Dr. Brown has prompted some discussion as well about things she's seen in our system that probably and should be improved. So we're also throwing that into the conversation as well. So there's kind of a lot in the transportation area, but I just want to make sure we're focused on the right areas. So thoughts?
I think one thing I would add to what's shown on page 19 that the board approved is removing all middle school transportation starting that year also. Which was a big part. That would also be different.
Yep. Which goes to Dawn's point about the mileage. Because the 1.75 and the 1, there's a big difference. And what Allie's referring to is the hazardous transportation plan was removed for middle school students. So they will then fall within the same thing that you just brought up, which is the 1.75 miles.
So the middle school and the high school essentially will be identical.
They will be, yep.
And intermediate's 1.5.
It's the intermediate school is 1.75.
That is
as well.
Set
Yep.
the same. Okay.
Yep.
So in terms of
It's
prior.
it's
It makes my head
huge
hurt.
product.
Yeah,
It seems to me we should address the most immediate of the problems. I'm not aware of massive dysfunction on the shuttle system. It's very complex, but it's not like City of Madison that is into November and they're still having delivery problems in mass. So I would like to see us maybe address the most immediate middle school, high school. Certainly, anything we can do to streamline them, with the electronic apps and that sort of thing would be a positive. In that the shuttle system is 20 years old. I think there might be a time to review it, but I'd like to put that on maybe a calendar, say, okay, get these two things done, and then we look at it in year 3 or something to that effect. I hate to do it all at once.
Yeah, and the reason why I ask, I don't understand how much that impact is, so I don't know what I'm asking for. So if we were to reduce all of the miles to a point of 1 mile, how much does that cost? I have no idea. Like, are we talking, if it ends up being $20,000, like, that's not an insignificant amount of money, but in the grand scheme, like, it's kind of a no-brainer for me at this point. If we're talking about $2 million, then it's a different conversation. But yeah, because it creates a parent issue, because I personally feel like 1.75 miles is too far to ask any of our students to walk to school. I'd really love to understand what that financial impact is. I do think that there's value there. We're talking about taking out non-value added things. I want to take that hurdle burden, whatever you want to call it, away for kids having access to school. So sorry.
I agree. It isn't just going out for a 1.7 mile walk. It's all they have to take. They've got, those kids just carry so much stuff. I agree. I would love to know what that would cost if we just say a mile for everybody. My concern about the shuttle system is the loss of instructional time that each school, sacrifices to do that. But I also understand it's such a great service for our community. I mean, to get kids all over the district, for parents not to have to worry about that, stay at work and, you know, not employ.
Without
It's such
duplicating
a
routes.
Service. It is such a service. It would be so hard not to do it. It's so hard when, you know, being in education, and I know I was in an upper grade, once you remove 10%, the whole school shuts down. It isn't just the 10% that get on the shuttle. It's then the mindset of the educator that says, I can't really do this because I'm losing 10%. I'm gonna have to redo it tomorrow anyway. So the whole system shuts down. So that's my biggest concern with the shuttle is it shuts down every school 10 minutes early. And that's a lot of time when you look at every day of every school year. But I also understand the service we are giving our community. So I don't know how to marry those two things together, but I agree with Mark. We can't do the whole busing in one conversation. And I think dealing with that middle school as it opens in 26 is our biggest.
So is it fair to say if we focus on understanding and collecting data on the 1 mile, focusing on consistency 1 mile across the organization, and also openness to continuing with the technology improvements?
Yes.
And maybe have that be our focus for right now.
Yep.
Not necessarily dive into like in the immediate term, the bigger picture issue with like the K4 shuttles, how we're transporting private schools and alternative transportation. Is that a good way to characterize it?
Yes.
I like that idea. But I also would recommend that we consider a public engagement. Once we've come up with some problem-solving options that we might want to present. I don't hear a lot of bus problems unless I experience it from my own personal family. Our neighborhood has more kids. It seems to be working for them. People aren't complaining when they're walking around the neighborhood. I'm not getting phone calls, but that doesn't mean there aren't problems. And so I think to maybe do the public engagement for those interested, we'll have a feel too for how big of a problem is it and what will they be willing to accept to provide a higher quality service.
And clear ideas. So like the two things that I hear most frequently are concerns around the overcrowding on the buses where students have been left to sit in the aisle or something like that. The other one was, hey, we lost service. We didn't know we were part of the frustration was we didn't realize that was the case until like 3 days before school started. And what they've indicated is that since in the same household, one student can and one student can't, and it's the middle school and the high school, they just go ahead and get on the bus anyway. So those are unaccounted for or unplanned for students that are just going ahead and taking the bus anyways, because this isn't a logical system, right? Could also result in the overcrowding situation. So, but it'd be great to hear from a larger number of parents and in a more systematic way. So I agree with you. Really a long way of saying I agree with you.
Yeah, thank you. That's great feedback.
Okay. That brings us to closure, unless there's other future agenda items anyone wants to request.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.